Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Police Accountability Report. As I always try to make clear, this show has a single purpose, holding the politically powerful institution of policing accountable. And to do so, we don't just focus on the bad behavior of individual cops. Instead, we also examine the system that makes bad policing possible. And today, we're going to achieve this goal by telling the story of a man who faced a $1 million bail for a Facebook post, and what his case says, not just about policing, but a critical facet of our criminal justice system that does not get the attention it deserves, namely the judges and prosecutors who make the system run. But before I get started, I want you watching to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct, please email it to us privately at par@therealnews.com, and we might be able to investigate for you. And of course, you can always message me directly at Taya's Baltimore on Facebook and Twitter, and please like and share and comment on our videos. It really does help us. And we now have a Patreon account called Accountability Reports. So if you have a few dollars to spare, it would really help us keep doing these investigations for you. So please look for the link pinned in the comments below. Okay, we've got all that out of the way. Let's get started. Now, of course, it goes without saying the name of the show is the Police Accountability Report, and thus our focus is usually on the police. But today, we're going to examine a branch of our criminal justice system that, as I mentioned before, does not get as much attention, but is just as problematic. And you, our viewers, have asked us to take a look at this. I'm talking about the judiciary of our sprawling law enforcement industrial complex. In some sense, it's far more powerful than the cops we see misbehaving on video, partially because much of the work that judges and prosecutors do happens in courtrooms and behind closed doors, work not subject to the same level of scrutiny facing officers on the street. In fact, the entire process of deciding who to prosecute and why can often be a mystery even to those charged with a crime. And that leads to obstacles when attempting to hold judges and prosecutors accountable. Just a short thought experiment. Think of how often you've heard of a police officer being disciplined or put on administrative leave or fired for malfeasance or corruption. Now think of how many times you've heard of a judge being disciplined, placed on leave, or fired. I'll wait. It's not easy, is it? As this report in Colorado judges found, the system for keeping judges in line is insular and not transparent. It also found that behavior went unpunished because, put simply, judges were judging other judges. Of course, I bring up Denver because holding the judiciary accountable was one of the most pressing topics for auditor and cop watcher Eric Brandt, a controversial activist whose admittedly offensive comments to judges netted him 12 years in prison. But that does not detract from the fact that Eric and his supporters spent years exposing problems with Colorado's judicial system, and many say those efforts had more to do with why he is now sitting in jail with a length of sentence often reserved for murderers or rapists. Which brings us to another case involving the country's judiciary, which just recently came to our attention. It involves a man named Joshua Martinez, a constitutional activist from Las Vegas who's been entangled in the legal system for an alleged crime similar to Brandt's. His story starts with this: an offensive Facebook post that shows police carrying a coffin with the caption, "How Cops Take Out the Trash." Now, it's important to note here for our viewers, PAR and the editorial staff of The Real News does not condone violence or threats of violence, but we also think there is value in reporting on how our legal system treats these possible threats and if the consequences fit the alleged crime. That's because there is a backstory to this post, and it's illustrative of the problem with how the judiciary responds to both criticisms and pushback from the people. It's also another stark example of how the border between free speech and public safety is often a precarious balance that should not be immune from scrutiny, even if we find the speech offensive. Just a bit more background here. Martinez has publicly described himself as a constitutionalist. He has posted quite a bit about both First and Second Amendment rights, and it's that history that Martinez supporters say is why he has been the subject of some extreme overreach by Nevada's criminal justice system. Consider how the judicial system responded to Martinez's Facebook post. The alleged threat he posted on Facebook led to multiple charges of online harassment, digital threats, 3 other counts including digital stalking, and Martinez was given a $1 million bond. and a gag order. We wanted to speak with Joshua on the record today, but we couldn't. He is unable to post on any social media platform or speak with any form of the press under the threat of incarceration. Making matters dicey is how this encounter in the courtroom between Judge Ann Elworth and Martinez unfolded during the proceedings regarding his offensive post, an exchange that only made his legal issues more thorny because he refused to apologize to a judge for asking a question. Let's watch.
Okay, Mr. Martinez, since you have informed me that I am in contempt of court and that you are in fact in charge of this courtroom, I'm going to go ahead and sentence you today to direct contempt of court. I will give you an opportunity to apologize if you choose to do so and behave in a manner that I consider appropriate for a courtroom. Would you like to do that today, Mr. Martinez?
I would like to proceed only if I can have my questions answered. That's all I want.
That wasn't my question, sir. Did you wish to have the opportunity to apologize and proceed in a manner that I consider appropriate for the courtroom?
What would I be
It is a
apologizing?
yes or a no question.
What would I be apologizing
For your direct contempt of court, sir.
All I was asking was legal questions, ma'am.
I disagree, sir. To tell me that you are in charge of this courtroom and tell me that I am in contempt is not asking legal questions. It is contempt of court. I'm going to ask you the question one more time. Did you wish to apologize and proceed in a manner I consider appropriate in this courtroom or not?
No.
Okay. Direct contempt. I'm going to sentence him to 15 days in jail, and we'll set it for video 15 days from today.
So as you can see, even though Joshua was only asking a question, he was subject to an arbitrary, and one could argue, questionable ruling by a judge, a ruling that had serious consequences because Martinez ended up in jail, and without the help of the auditor and activist communities to post his jail, he might still be sitting incarcerated for months on end. But that is not the only time Joshua was in absurd court proceedings. His freedom was on the line as a probation officer argued that there were weapons present in his sister's home. What were these dangerous devices? Well, I'll let the court explain.
Did you notice any other weapons in the common areas?
Yes, while I was standing in the living room with all the occupants, I noticed a fire poker and a baseball bat, a fire poker and a baseball bat, a fire poker and a baseball bat behind the front door. And I informed Mr. Martinez that those were considered weapons due to how they were being stored.
And these decisions had serious consequences for Martinez. In fact, he spent almost 5 months in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a cell, without even being formally convicted of a crime. But there is even more to this case than a high bail and a seemingly fraught decision by a judge. And for more of that, I'm joined by my reporting partner, Stephen Jamis, who's been looking into the case. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me.
Tay, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Stephen, there is more to the case than meets the eye, especially the police detective who was the subject of the alleged threat and who's also apparently instrumental in an investigation into Martinez. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say this. When I look at this case, it's really one of those mainstream media liturgies where we create a sort of guilt cloud over someone by association. I mean, technically, he's never been accused of a violent crime, but yet there's been breathless article after article throughout. Like even the Daily Beast picked up on his story and wrote about him because of his associations, not because of his actions. And I think it shows exactly how social media occludes meaning to people's associations and some of the things they express, but not exactly their actions. So where symbolism like overrides any sort of reality. And I think that's part of what mainstream media uses to generate clicks and why they lack the context and the complexity of a person. Remember what we talked about before in the show. Rich, elite people are complex and people who aren't are simplistic. And that's exactly what's happened in this story.
Now, you reached out to Detective Kenneth Mead for comment. What did he say?
Well, what's really interesting about Detective Mead is his salary. Last year, he made $200,000, according to Transparent Nevada. And over the past 5 years, he's earned, or cost the city taxpayers, roughly $1 million. And I think that's part of the important point here to think about this case. Guys making, $150,000 plus benefits, $200,000, over $1 million spent on him. What has he done? As James brought up in his video, and he'll talk about later, he was supposed to be investigating the Las Vegas shooter. Nothing has come out of that. So what does he have to do? Create cases, maybe. I mean, when you get paid that much money, you got to shake some trees, right? So I think the best question is, why is he making so much money?
So finally, what sort of accountability is there for judges and prosecutors? What sort of obstacles are there to holding them accountable?
Well, perfect example is how the Justice Department is trying to make grand jury proceedings secret for 50 years. I mean, you get indicted by grand juries. And grand juries are secret for reasons because, if someone doesn't get indicted, you don't want all this information leaking out. But since most grand juries indict everybody the prosecutors bring to them, it's kind of scary to think for 50 years you're not going to be able to know what goes on. So there is so much that goes on behind closed doors, so much that we never hear about. And I think it's a little scary.
And now for more insight into this case, I'm joined by a cop watcher and auditor who has been following it closely. His name is James Freeman, and he is a tireless cop watcher with a very popular YouTube channel. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, Joshua is still under a gag order, so we are really fortunate to have you speak about this case. And you did some excellent reporting here, especially into the background of the detective. Can you talk a little bit about what you uncovered?
So this all stems back to a few years ago, really, when Joshua was cited for carrying a firearm illegally or unlawfully. And he wasn't even guilty of the charge, but like a lot of people, he took a plea. And that's where this really all started. That's when they got their hooks into him. And ever since then, this detective, Kenneth Mead, has been coming after Josh, even though Josh has never harmed anybody. He's never been anything except for a outspoken activist. And I think it's worthy to note that Kenneth Mead is also the detective that's supposed to be investigating the Las Vegas shooting. And there's been zero progress on that case. Nobody's heard anything about it. And Kenneth Mead has spent all of his time going after Joshua Martinez for making Facebook posts that he doesn't like, for making videos attempting to document government and police activity to help keep them accountable. And this is what Kenneth Mead is spending his time going after. Instead of finding closure for the families of people who lost their lives in that shooting in Las Vegas.
So how can police conduct such extensive surveillance against a nonviolent person? I mean, what allows this type of investigation to proceed legally? I mean, Martinez's Facebook post would have only been seen by his Facebook friends. So doesn't it seem like the officer was monitoring his Facebook and social media pages?
Yes, he is being monitored. And it came out later. There were some things that Kenneth Mead testified to, such as he said that Joshua Martinez had made this post and that the law enforcement was unable to find Joshua Martinez. So he said that he felt threatened and he didn't know where Joshua Martinez was to be able to do anything like maybe take him into custody. It turns out later on, it was testified that both the federal government and local police had 24-hour surveillance on Joshua Martinez at his father's house, as well as at another property where Joshua was actually staying at. And how they can do that legally, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, these people aren't really worried about what's legal and illegal, because if they were, they never would have arrested him for free speech in the first place.
When his probation was being negotiated, weren't you, James Freeman, cited as one of the reasons he should be denied release?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Myself and Clash with Bow had made a trip up to Las Vegas. I'd known Josh for years. Actually, Joshua's activism started long before mine did. And Josh reached out to me on Facebook one day and said, "Hey, I know you don't know who I am, but I'm Josh Martinez." And I responded right away. And I said, "Are you kidding? I know exactly who you are." And so, we had never actually gotten to meet up yet, though. And so when I was in Las Vegas, I met up with him. And I believe he was on probation at the time or something. He had some terms and conditions he was supposed to be under, but he wasn't violating any of them. But one of those terms was that he not be associating with and hanging out with felons. And Kenneth Mead and the prosecution falsely claimed that I was a felon, which I am not.
So what are the charges against Joshua? I mean, I believe harassment, stalking, using the internet to stalk were some of the charges, right? But wasn't he also charged for handing out pocket-sized copies of the Constitution?
Of course, they're not fair charges. I'm not familiar with with him getting charged with handing out pocket constitutions. But what I do find, I guess, troubling, it really doesn't shock me at all. The government always likes to charge people with what they're doing. So they've charged him with harassment and stalking, and yet they have admitted to having 24-hour surveillance on him. If I put 24-hour surveillance on you, Taya, you would say that I'm stalking you, and rightfully so. And you know, Josh never did any of this. The posts that he made were made to his friends. They weren't directed at these individuals claiming harassment and stalking. They were, you know, we talk about things like this. You and I are talking about it right now with each other, not to Kenneth Meade. And essentially, that's what Josh was doing.
So the bail was set at $1 million. How did the authorities justify such a high bail?
I don't even know how they justify that. I think that again goes back to it doesn't matter what the law is. That was the highest bail ever for a person for charges like that in the history of the United States. And again, we're talking about a nonviolent individual who's never harmed a hair on anybody's head. And so, yeah, we've got rapists, pedophiles, you know, we've got real criminals. We've got Amber Geiger, who actually walked into somebody's apartment and murdered them. I mean, we've never seen a bail like this ever before.
So moving on to the idea of simply holding the judiciary accountable, what kind of problems have you seen with judges, and how critical a role do you think they play in the process of criminal justice?
Judges are absolutely 100% untouchable as far as I've seen. We talk about qualified immunity, and which is a huge issue with police officers. It's 10 times. It's times 10 for the immunity that judges seem to have. They are absolutely never accountable for their actions or inactions. And so, I mean, I don't know if I were allowed to do anything I want with zero consequences ever, geez, my imagination's running wild. But you know, that's the situation that we're in here. Both Kenneth Meade's got qualified immunity. The judge has immunity. Any decent human being would have had this thrown out immediately. It's baffling. And you know, maybe years ago it was shocking to me. Now it's really not. But I think it's still shocking to a lot of people who have not yet seen that these people have zero regard for law and order.
Now, I know you've already spoken publicly about this, but what is your reaction to the sentence of Eric Brandt to 12 years in prison?
Oh man, that one makes me really sad. I love Eric Brandt, and he got 12 years. Amber Geiger, I think, was sentenced to 10, and then I think that's on appeal anyways. You know, I just wish he hadn't taken a plea. and I think that this is what happens. I mean, we're talking about the same thing with Josh Martinez. The way they got their hooks into him was because he took a plea to something that he did not do. And it's the same thing with Eric Brandt. You know, what Eric Brandt said, I find personally to be morally disturbing, but certainly not illegal. And I think that Eric Brandt maybe looked back and thought about it and said, you know what, that it may have been legal, but it wasn't really right. And maybe that was why he took the plea, but it does not matter, because once the government gets their hooks into you, the sentence it's not justified. There's no sentence justified and when you have not committed a crime.
What do you think can be done to hold both judges and prosecutors accountable?
I will tell you this. We have there are some people who think that we've made progress in holding police accountable. And I'm not an optimist, or I'm sorry, I'm not a pessimist, but I like to be a realist. And just a few days ago, Philip Turner went and recorded at a police station. And Philip Turner has case law in, I believe it's the Fifth Circuit, Turner versus Driver, saying that if you can be there, you can record there. And it was based on exactly what he was doing at this other police station. So we've got laws saying that you can record in public. Philip Turner got case law saying that you can record in public. And these police are still going after people and arresting them for recording in public, and prosecutors are still prosecuting, and judges are still finding people guilty in many of these cases. So accountability, no, that's not going to exist. The only thing my only goal is to show more people that we do not live in a system of law and order. We live in a system of the guy with the biggest stick wins. And that's all there is to it. And by showing people time and time and time again, this guy didn't break the law, he still got in trouble. the cop's not accountable, the prosecutor's not accountable, the judge is not accountable. Can you really argue to me that we can fight for accountability? How?
Now, this case raises a very vexing question about our criminal justice system, not just about how judges or prosecutors behave, but the very nature of the system itself. To understand what I mean, consider a book written almost 100 years ago and what it reveals about the underlying imperative of the massive bureaucracy which adjudicates our laws. The book is called The Trial. It's a novel written by the famous Czech author Franz Kafka, a writer who I think is awfully wrongly characterized as a purveyor of macabre tales or terrifying stories. But what I really think is that that is a simplistic take on Kafka. In fact, I think what was truly terrifying about his work is how he uses literature to explore the often treacherous gap between how we perceive ourselves and what we truly are. One of the ways he explores this idea is by examining a facet of human civilization that is rarely objectively examined but warrants more attention. I'm talking about bureaucracies, the large and impersonal administrators of state power that are often perceived as impassive and merciless, but also play a crucial role in human psychology that writers like Kafka understood quite well. In The Trial, he recounts the travails of Kay, a young man who wakes up one morning and finds himself subject to an arrest. The problem, though, is that no one will tell him why he's being arrested. It's a predicament that continues throughout the novel as Kay tries to learn the nature of the charges against him, a quest that becomes more and more futile as the story unfolds. It's not just the charges against him which remain a mystery. He's also prevented from learning the names of the judges who would be presiding over his case. He also finds it nearly impossible to locate the courtroom where the trial will occur. What I think Kafka is pointing out here is a subtle but important point, a sharp divide between the way our justice system is portrayed and how it actually operates. In a sense, he likens the bureaucracy's justice to a form of collective self-deception, a constellation of state force and power wielded with the intent to make us forget fundamental human truths about ourselves. It's a human invention that is as intrinsically cruel as it is potent, a source of power for many because within its labyrinths, the existential questions and doubts of the mind are subsumed and contained. It's a centripetal social force bent upon supplanting our human interconnectedness with ritual, artifice, and imperious language, or motions, pleas, feigned objectivity, and inexplicable judgments. I guess what I'm saying is that a system as mindless as our current judicial system is only possible because it is so disconnected from who we truly are. Kafka suggests this is a process designed to be inhumane because it cannot function without the indifference to our true selves. A thought perhaps too horrifying to contemplate. I mean, if you think about the character in The Trial, is his plight so different than the other people we've covered on the show? Does Mr. Martinez really know who his accuser is? Can you really administer justice when you can also literally gag a person from talking about his own case? Let me repeat that. He has been barred from talking about his own case or he will be imprisoned. Can we really judge Mr. Martinez's words if he can't tell us what they were and why he said them? He's facing anywhere from 2 to 15 years in prison for words he can't discuss. How Kafkaesque is that? I think Kafka would agree that there is a hidden imperative in our justice system that we often fail to acknowledge. That is, the bureaucratic leanings of our law enforcement industrial complex are far removed from the notions of justice it was designed to implement. Instead, as Kafka made clear with his character Kay, it is often simply an elaborate camouflage for the human cruelty that arises when we fail to embrace just how human we all are. The point is that the only way to create a system that espouses and embraces equality and justice is to recognize its flaws and confront them. And the only way to achieve that goal is to make the process transparent, to hold the people who control it accountable. Well, that's why we call this show the Police Accountability Report, because we will continue to do just that. I'd like to thank my guest, James Freeman, for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you so much for your work and your time, James. And of course, I have to thank intrepid reporter Stephen Janis for his time, his writing, his research, and editing on this piece. Thank you, Stephen.
Tay, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And of course, I have to thank friend of the show, Noli D, for her support. Thanks, Noli D. And I want you watching to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct or brutality, please share it with us and we might be able to investigate. please reach out to us. You can always email us tips privately at par@therealnews.com and share your evidence of police misconduct. You can also message us at Police Accountability Report on Facebook or Instagram, or at Eyes on Police on Twitter. And of course, you can always message me directly at Tejas Baltimore on Twitter and Facebook. And please like and comment. I do read your comments and appreciate them, and I try to answer your questions whenever I can. My name is Taya Graham, and I am your host of the Police Accountability Report. Please be safe out there.